Hi everybody, Dr. Britt Talley Daniel MD, and I'm a neurologist and headache doctor. Today I'm talking about, is alcohol a migraine trigger? Well, migraine is present in 12% of the world population, and in women 3 times more frequently than in men. In one study, 25% of women had migraine at age 42, and 6% of men had migraine at age 38. After which the incidence of migraine decreased. Migraine is the most common chronic medical problem for women. For migraine in women, it's more common than high blood pressure, arthritis, diabetes. Migraine headaches are frequently one-sided, associated with moderate to severe throbbing headache pain, nausea, vomiting, sensitivity to light and sound. Migraines are disabling, with the patient oftentimes missing work or social activities. There are thought to be many relationships which trigger a migraine headache, such as menstruation for women, fasting, or stress. One of the most commonly stated but not quite scientifically documented migraine triggers is drinking alcohol, especially red wine. And this article is going to explore the neurology literature on this subject. So the question is alcohol a migraine trigger? And the answer is alcohol is commonly stated to be a trigger, but by many patients, and it's accepted by many doctors, but control studies regarding consumption of alcohol triggering migraine are mostly positive for red wine only. There are confusing results that limit the relationships with other forms of alcohol. Well, what are older personal, non-scientific statements about migraine? Older historical statements are stronger than newer, more carefully constructed scientific research studies, that is for sure. One of the earliest references concerning migraine with alcohol was made by Celsius, who lived year 25 to 50 BC. And he said the pain is contracted by drinking wine. There you go. Another earlier statement was made by Paul of Aegina. He lived 625 through 698 AD. Who commented on the relationship between drinking wine and the occurrence of migraine. Paulus Argentina in the 7th century described migraine from drinking of wine. It's been thought that certain chemicals in alcohol, such as tyramine and histamine, act in the brain to set off migraine headache. Well, who educates people about triggers? The National Headache Foundation, the American Headache Society, many migraine websites, and doctors who write on migraine advocate attention to alcohol and dietary factors to avoid migraine, and often provide a list of foods and chemicals that are suspected of doing this. However, the whole question of migraine worsened by various foods and alcohol is controversial and very confusing. What do expert neurologists who write about migraine say? Well, Lance, the famous Australian neurologist who first wrote about ice pick headache in 1995, he wrote, "My patients with special food triggers have the same number of migraine attacks when they avoid triggers as before. The only thing at which they agreed is that alcohol precipitates attacks, especially red wine. Otherwise, I think the question of dietary migraine is very suspect." Dr. Lance. Well, what is a trigger? Let's define that too. The American Headache Society webpage states the following, that a migraine trigger is any factor that causes a headache in individuals who are prone to develop headache. Only a small proportion of migraine sufferers, however, can clearly identify their triggers. Examples of triggers include stress, sleep disturbance, fasting, hormones, bright or flickering lights, odors, cigarette smoke, alcohol, aged cheeses, chocolate, monosodium glutamate, nitrates of aspartame, and caffeine. For some women, the decline in the blood level of estrogen during the onset of menstruation is a trigger for migraine headaches. So that's been studied and seen as truthful. The interval between exposure to a trigger and the onset of headache varies from hours to 2 days. Exposure to a trigger does not always lead to a headache, though. Conversely, avoidance of triggers cannot completely prevent headaches. What a deal. Migraine trigger literature review. I'll start with Dr. Kelman writing an article in Cephalalgia in 2007 on the triggers are precipitants of the acute migraine attack. Okay, and he listed stress at a 79% incidence and hormones at 65%, and migraine was down near the bottom at 37%. Smoke was 35%, sleeping late 32%. So the big things there are stress, hormones, not eating, weather. Gallagher, writing in Headache in 1988 on diet and migraine, stated, alcohol is a non-specific vasodilator that is thought to provoke migraine headaches in susceptible persons by depressing or altering the function of central vasomotor centers, since the direct effect of alcohol in blood vessels is insignificant. He said also, of all the known precipitating agents, alcohol is the most consistent provoker of headache in the largest number of migraine patients. Littlewood et al. Wrote in The Lancet in 1988 on red wine as a cause of migraine, and they studied a group of patients, and at the end of this they said that 9 out of 11 red wine sensitive patients reported migraine after drinking wine, but none of the other 8 patients reported migraine after drinking vodka. So anyway, the doctor went on and stated that flavonoids and substances in red wine, which are absent in white wine, may cause headaches, and they suggested studies be done to discover the chemical agents provoking migraine. Dr. Diamond, writing in Neurology Forum in 1991 on dietary factors of vascular headache, stated, many migraine patients will report an acute attack precipitated by consumption of alcoholic beverages such as red wine. Jarman et al. Described the release of 14C5-hydroxytryptamine from human platelets by red wine in an article they wrote in 1991. They said, since 5-HT is probably released from body stores during migraine attacks, and red wine is known to provoke migraine episodes in susceptible individuals, release of 5-HT, possibly from central stores, could represent a plausible mechanism for its mode of action. Again, just a theory, nothing proven. Spearings, writing in Headache Quarterly in 1992 on headache caused by medications and chemicals, stated alcohol can also precipitate the so-called hangover headache in those who are not subject to headaches. Hangover headache occurs in up to 50% of patients or subjects with alcohol intake of 1.5 milliliter or more per kilogram of body weight. It is generalized in location, often throbbing in nature, and accentuated by sudden movements of the head. Peatfield wrote in Headache in 1995 on relationships between food, wine, and beer precipitated migrainous headaches. They looked at a bunch of patients. Out of 577 patients in a migraine clinic, migraine occurred in 429, and 16% of those reported headaches that were brought on by cheese or chocolate, or nearly always both. Of the migraine patients, 18% reported sensitivity to all alcoholic drinks, while another 11% were sensitive to red but not white wine. Beer provoked a migraine in 28% of these patients. So it was concluded that cheese, chocolate, and red wine sensitivity in particular have closely related mechanisms in some way, related more to migraine than to more chronic tension type headache, while quite separate mechanisms play a major role in sensitivity to alcoholic drinks in general. Kwanzniska, writing in 2000 in a Russian journal, said, red wine in medicine, is it a panacea, fashion, or a risk factor? And they tried to put the red wine issue in perspective and acknowledge that red wine had been the subject of much interest in healthcare professionals representing different specialties in medicine. They stated, in general, the cardioprotective mechanism of red wine, although not completely understood, are thought to relate to ethanol, which increases high-density lipoprotein cholesterol and inhibits platelet aggregation. Red wine also contains flavonoids and different medicines and chemicals which have antioxidant, vasorelaxing, and antiplatelet properties. They point out that there's a considerable body of evidence indicating that regular consumption of red wine at moderate doses of 200 to 400 milliliters per day provides protection against ischemic heart disease, perhaps diabetes, osteoporosis, and some cancers. The authors then stress the dangers of alcohol intake too much, which are dependence, alcoholism, organic disease, migraine, and allergies. Advise that, quote, medical recommendations of red wine consumption be formulated by doctors very carefully. One has to balance the good medical effects of red wine with the bad to get a clear picture. Panconisi takes a similar global view of the place of red wine in health in an article entitled Alcohol and Migraine, Trigger Factors, Consumption Mechanisms. That was in the journal Headache Pain in 2008. This study used a Medline search which looked at the subjects of headache and alcohol, headache and wine, migraine and alcohol, and migraine and wine. Those are retrospective studies, and about a third of the migraine patients reported alcohol as a frequent migraine trigger, but only 10% of migraine patients reported alcohol as a frequent migraine trigger. They thought that different chemicals related responsible to migraine, but there was uncertainty about which chemicals were there that did it. Pancosi et al. Closed stating that alcohol-induced migraine is a very individual-specific reaction. Some people have reactions to it, some didn't. They wrote another article on migraine and alcohol in 2003. And it's a legacy contribution from the American Headache Society, Committee for Headache Education. And they had a list of things they summarized with this paper. Number one, alcohol is a migraine trigger, but its risk is overstated. Number two, alcohol can provoke two types of headaches in migraine patients, an attack within a few hours and a delayed hangover headache. Three, migraine patients consume alcohol less often than the general public. Four, although migraine sufferers consider red wine the principal migraine trigger, studies show that other alcoholic drinks are equally more frequently the cause. Number five, alcohol and not different constituents of the drink is probably the trigger. So they think it's more alcohol than sulfites or phenols or other chemicals. Number six, a small dose of alcohol, such as a 5-ounce glass of good wine, can be assumed if it does not trigger migraine frequently. Drink in small amounts to the benefit of your heart, but use caution with breast cancer risk. Pancosi also asked, how important is alcohol as a migraine trigger? So they talked about that. And they said that no difference exists between migraine and tension type headache, cluster headache patients who have higher alcohol sensitivity. Well, what's the interval from alcohol consumption to the start of a headache? Alcohol can trigger a migraine attack within a few hours. That's 30 minutes to 3 hours is what they were considering. This is the typical headache induced by alcohol. Another type is the delayed alcohol-induced headache, which is called like the hangover headache. And that appears the next morning after alcohol intake. At this time, the blood alcohol level is falling and reaches 0. So the symptoms of headache is present in 2/3 of subjects with alcohol hangover. The hangover headache can be experienced by anyone, but people with migraine are more susceptible to a hangover headache. Furthermore, migraine patients can develop headaches with the ingestion of modest amount of alcohol. All alcoholic drinks can provoke either immediate or a delayed headache. Alcohol consumption in migraine. Since alcohol can trigger a migraine attack, in a sense only a small number of migraineurs should drink alcohol anyway. Population-based studies performed in various countries show that fewer migraine sufferers consume alcohol than those without headaches. Moreover, the more alcohol consumed, the less likely the drinker reported migraine and non-migraine headache. This fact may be explained by sufferers of headache giving up alcohol since it is a trigger factor for their headache attacks. Is alcohol another component of the drink, the headache trigger? This was looked at again. Red wine is typically considered the most likely alcohol drink trigger. In 1988, Littlewood and colleagues showed that 300 milliliters or 10 ounces of red wine, but not vodka, with an equivalent alcohol content provoked headache in red wine-sensitive migraineurs. Migraineurs not sensitive to wine and non-headache controls did not have headaches triggered. They suggested that red wine contains a migraine-provoking agent that is not alcohol. Some studies in France and Italy report white wine is the major culprit. Oh boy, how confusing. However, there are reports of also spirits, sparkling wine, and beer triggering headache. Wine is not to be ingested in large quantities to produce headache. In wine-sensitive patients, the time between drinking red wine and developing headache varied from 30 minutes to 3 hours. Only 1 or 2 glasses at most need to be ingested. The fundamental question still remains to be made definitely clear. Is alcohol or another component of the drink responsible for triggering headache? It remains difficult to answer that question. And so they've looked at histamine, they looked at tyramine, they looked at flavonoids, and they really couldn't decide the answer on that. Well, should migraine patients avoid alcohol consumption? Alcohol in low dose, especially red wine, reduces the risk of cardiovascular disease. Migraine, specifically with aura or high-frequency migraine, increases the risk of cardiovascular diseases. The unselective suggestion of alcohol abstinence for all migraine patients is not correct. In fact, patients with high migraine frequency with increased risk of ischemic stroke may benefit from a low dose of alcohol. Certainly, alcoholic drinks may trigger migraine and tension headache in some subjects. This is probably much less likely than that suggested by the patient's recall. Moreover, it's frequently necessary to consume alcohol, and with other factors, you got to think about anxiety, stress events, emotions to trigger a headache attack. That could have been going on when they're drinking the alcohol. Who knows? You got to study that. Before alcohol is considered responsible for migraine attack, the patient should review certain factors, and these include careful recording of the intake amount of alcohol, the specific drink types, the frequency of induced headache to the amount and type, and the 48 hours prior to headache, and any situation or stress prior to the alcohol intake. Remember, stress is always the number one thing aggravating migraine. Underwater, writing in 2008 on alcoholic beverages as a trigger factor and the effect of alcohol consumption behavior in patients with migraine, in the European Journal of Neurology, stated that our study shows the effect that this trigger, that is, alcoholic beverages, has on patients with over 25% of patients with migraine not consuming alcohol because of the presumed triggering effect. So, is alcohol really a migraine trigger? Migraine is an inherited genetic medical problem. The genes for migraine, with or without aura, have been found, and data has been published about that. You're born with migraine, you can die with it unless some scientists learn how to change your genes. The exact relationship for and if alcohol aggravates migraine isn't clear. Currently, migraine experts believe alcohol may cause a change in brain activity which affects neurochemicals and neuronal transmission. Well, what about alcohol and cluster headache? The diagnostic classification of headache disorders, number 3, the first, cluster headache is one of the trigeminal autonomic neuralgias. The first classification of migraine used in the United States, published in the 1980s, considered cluster headache to be a kind of migraine, but today the two conditions are seen separately but with some similar features. For instance, cluster headache, like migraine, responds to an injection of 6 milligrams of sumatriptan, which works in 10 minutes. However, it's known that when a cluster headache patient consumes alcohol during their cluster headache time, which is 1 to 7 headaches a day for 6 weeks, about alcohol will then trigger a cluster headache. This relationship is only true during their cluster time, and they can drink at other times without fear of a cluster headache if they're not currently having headaches. What about other migraine triggers? Are they real? Many triggers are thought to trigger an attack of episodic migraine. Mamor, writing in Current Pain Headache Reports in 2018, stated that although the experimental trigger, glyceryl trinitite, probably produces migraine, natural triggers are much less predictable and vary in importance between individuals. Many migraine triggers have been established based on patient surveys, dietary studies, and clinical trials. The reliable, well-known triggers are stress, menstrual cycle changes, weather changes, sleep disturbances, alcohol, and certain foods. Also, fasting, premenstrual periods in women, letdown after stress, headaches, and most likely low barometric pressure changes are migraine triggers. Migraine may have early prodrome before the headache symptoms such as neck pain, fatigue, sensitivity to light, sounds, and odors. Multiple studies clearly demonstrate triggers in episodic migraine often related to changes in homeostasis or environment. Many common migraine triggers are not easily modifiable, and avoiding triggers may not be realistic. But healthy lifestyle choices such as exercise, adequate sleep, stress management, and eating regularly may prevent triggers and transformation to chronic migraine over time. Well, is there a difference between migraine triggers and aggravation? There's a language definition of that in the International Classification of Headache. They differentiate migraine trigger from migraine aggravated by time, which is usually 48 hours. So triggers come on quickly. Migraine aggravation is something that goes on like 40 hours. I'm going to quote from my book, Migraine, about that quote. Since antiquity has been recognized that the brain of a person with migraine is overly sensitive to different environmental, physical, and emotional factors, and that attacks of migraine may follow the episode or the continual occurrence of one of the factors. These provocative events are called trigger factors if they increase the probability of a migraine attack in the short term, usually about 48 hours, or aggravating factors if they're associated with a relatively long-term increase in severity or frequency of attacks occurring usually weeks to months. They give an example of aggravating factors as psychosocial factors, frequent intake of alcoholic beverages, other environmental factors. Regarding trigger factors, the International Classification of Headache Disorder states that though some trigger factors have been reasonably well studied epidemiologically, like menstruation, or in clinical trials like chocolate and aspartame, causal attribution in individual patients may be difficult. That's what we started out with. Well, can migraine provoke two kinds of headache with migraine? I'll go back into that. Migraine can trigger migraine if the headache comes within 10 minutes after drinking alcohol. This immediate response is usually only found in persons with migraine. Alcohol can commonly cause a later occurring headache called a hangover headache in a non-migraineur, especially if they drink a lot and the headache comes after a delayed period of time after sleep the next morning. Persons with migraine may be more sensitive to hangovers than the ordinary person. So, what a discussion there. I'll leave you with it to ponder it. Please click subscribe down there so we can stay in touch with each other. Look for me on YouTube for other migraine and general medical articles I have published there. And I will see you on the next talk. Thanks for listening.